Welcome back to Presidents and Politics. It's good to be back.
It is.
It's good to be back. You had a good Christmas break. And seeing that it's the first one back, I guess that's why we're doing a doubleheader.
Yes, we are.
But we'll do 2 and 1. This is your BOGO week.
Yeah.
Listen to 1, get 2 thrown in. So we're going to pick up, though, with James Garfield. And what an interesting... He honestly is one of my favorite presidents that we never got to see what he could become, right?
True.
Assassinated so early in, but what an interesting man. I often wonder, had he got a full term, especially 2 terms, how the country would have been different.
True. He was, he was probably one of the last self-made presidents we had. One of the last ones to be raised in a log cabin.
Very Lincoln-esque.
Very Lincoln-esque.
Very Lincoln-esque.
And he decided he wanted to go see the world as a sailor and made as far as the canals, where he led a mule team to bring, flatboats down the canal. I
read that while he was in that job, he fell overboard 16 times, and he didn't know how to swim.
Amazing.
So they before long they're like, hey, this isn't the job for you.
Yeah.
And they get him, and he goes back home, and he's a school teacher for a while. But yeah,
school teacher.
That was
college
what kind
professor,
of ended that career.
College president.
Yes. By the age of 26.
Yes. Amazing.
Right? Like, yeah. And here's what's so amazing. He works his way through college. So, and you know a lot of this. He goes to college and dirt poor. Dirt
Very.
poor. So he works as a carpenter and as a janitor. Within a few years, he's basically, in today's time, what we call like a GA, like a graduate assistant. Right. Then he's an assistant professor. And then he is the president of a college by 26. So he comes in as this poor kid mopping the floors. Yeah. And by age 26, he's the president of the university.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he gets elected to the Ohio Senate.
He does. And also like Lincoln, what we're talking about his early life, he never knew his father.
No, his father died when he was 2.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his father, I actually did some reading on his father because they're of Irish blood. His father's this really interesting guy. His father made an early career as a professional wrestler, actually.
I did not know that.
Yes. They said how strong he was. He's really large. Garfield's a pretty big dude, too.
Yeah, he was.
He was well over 200 in a time that was pretty rare. And they said of Garfield's dad that his party trick, if you will, was that he would pick up a barrel of whiskey and would drink out of the borehole. Now, a barrel of whiskey, if it's full, I had to look this up when I was teaching this several semesters ago. A barrel of whiskey, if it's full, is 520 pounds.
Oh, come on.
Seriously. Now, did he pick it up full? Was it half full? I don't know. It's still ridiculously impressive, but this is like the bloodline.
I was going to say, that's a bear of a man there.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
And this is the bloodline that Garfield comes from. So you have this like preconceived idea, right? That Garfield's going to be this minor league baseball player who gets drunk and is crazy.
Yes.
That's not. He's actually a very smart literary man. He's a Renaissance man.
He is.
In many ways.
He is, but he's also a great military man.
He is an incredible military leader.
He joins the Union Army, fights in, I guess, the Battle of Shiloh, the Battle of Chickamauga.
And actually has his horse wounded underneath him in the Battle of Shiloh while he is a general lieutenant colonel at that time. He's high ranking.
Yeah.
But he's still working behind the scenes the whole time and continues riding through on a wounded horse. So he's not that commander who hides in the background like some did.
No, he really took on a fight and then had himself elected to the United States Congress while he was still in the Army.
Yes.
And on the influence of Abraham Lincoln, who convinced him to give up his commission and serve in the United States Congress, which he did.
His mother said of him, by the way, on his mind, that he learned how to read and was reading books at the age of 3.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
When he was, I think it was in Congress. He served, 9 times?
Yeah,
in Congress?
18 years. Yeah.
Okay, he served 9 times in Congress, and they questioned him a little bit about like his intellect, because more than likely he probably had the highest IQ of any president. Now he didn't have the opportunities of like a Jefferson or an Adams or one of these guys who had just been able to voraciously study from an early. I mean, Jefferson's earliest memory was being carried by a servant on a pillow, right?
Yeah. But he did teach Greek and Latin.
He did. He did so much so that when he was in Congress, somebody had asked him something about his education, and he answered the question, get this, writing Greek with one hand and Latin with the other hand, and wrote out the answer, then asked him if they wanted to bring a translator, check it, they could. This was the mind this guy had. And I like that he's kind of like put up or shut up, right? Like just here.
They also say that when he was in Congress, sometimes he would leave the session and go down to the mall and watch professional baseball.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Interesting. He's a good guy then.
Yes, exactly.
He probably would have been a Braves fan in today's time. Yeah. But no, I love this about Garfield. He's just such an interesting guy. He's also a very devout follower of Christ. He is a devout Christian, wanted to become a pastor actually early on, considered being a pastor, and his mind is so, again, I just think about his mind. His mind was so interesting that he's chosen to give the commencement speech as a student, and his speech was on the matter of dualistic natures or something like that. It was like a metaphysical speech on dualism and like Plato and Aristotle's view of like Gnosticism or something. But you look at this guy's mind and you're thinking, and we've said this over and over again, but where are these guys?
Yes, you're right.
Men and women, where are these politicians? Yeah. And another thing that he reminds me of that you and I have talked about a lot on this podcast is the lack of desire for political power. And you and I actually
he's a reluctant president.
100%.
I mean, the way he becomes nominated for president is just is outrageous.
Yes.
I mean, he doesn't want it.
Yes.
In fact, he's working against it. He doesn't want to be nominated.
He called it, I wrote this down, he said he didn't want to become a mountain. The office of president was to him a bleak mountain.
Yeah.
A bleak mountain. And again, this reminds you of Washington, right? Remember Washington thought it was like going to the gallows to go.
Yeah.
Reagan was similar to this. He wanted to be left alone on his ranch in California. And Truman. You and I were discussing this in a class we're teaching together, this idea of not wanting political power. And Plato, of course, said that only a person who doesn't desire power is fit for it. And you and I had this whole conversation in a class.
Garfield was there.
Yeah, and how do we find that in today's time? How do we find people who don't want power, but they're the ones we need to be having power?
In the election of 1880, because Rutherford B. Hayes is not going to be nominated, so the Republicans are trying to figure out who they're going to put up. They're going to put up Grant again. They're going to put up who was it? Blaine from Minnesota, Maine, and then Sherman, who's the Secretary of the Treasury.
Yes.
And you have what I liked is that you have these different factions now in the Republican Party. You have the stalwarts
and the
right wing, with the half breeds, which are today's rhinos, I guess. And after 36 ballots of trying to nominate somebody, and Garfield saying, "Look, I want Sherman to do it. I want Sherman to do it." And he makes a speech that impresses everybody at the convention, and on the 36th ballot, they nominate him, and he's like, "I don't want this.
Right?
I don't want to be president."
Yes.
And he becomes president.
And I think he honestly would have been one of the best. I would have loved to see him get a full term.
The Pension Act, which he did not live long enough to see, but what he believed in was merit-based civil service.
That's correct.
Not patronage, which had been, when we talk about Arthur, we'll get into that. But he took on Roscoe Conklin.
Yes, he does.
Powerful senator from New York who believed in patronage, and Garfield said no, and so Conklin decides, you know what, we're not going to approve your appointment, and so Garfield says, okay, well then we're not going to appoint anybody. We're not even going to appoint your friends. So Conklin, which was one of the stupidest political moves I think ever could be, but he was so full of hubris. Conklin believes that he can resign and shut everything down and then get reelected to his position and show Garfield. And it's like he resigns, and with him, he never comes back. Yes. He doesn't get reelected. He doesn't, and so Garfield wins that one.
Because there's an important life lesson there. You're not indispensable. Absolutely. You can always be replaced.
Absolutely. Nobody remembers.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, that's the one thing that politicians have to understand. Nobody's going to remember you.
Because go ask them in the street who Garfield was. Go find anyone. Be like, hey, tell me about this guy. Because he was so popular and so powerful. Tell me about this guy.
Exactly.
Some history professors probably wouldn't know who that was.
You're probably right.
Truth be told.
You're probably right.
So I think that I love that. And that's one of the things I like about this podcast is we look at individuals in history, but also there's so many life lessons to be taken from these individuals. That's why history is so powerful. And you and I were talking before this podcast even started that humanities are powerful because you learn how to communicate, but you can also see yourself in other people.
Yes, you can. And when we do these podcasts, and what we try to do is show how these people struggled themselves.
That's right. They were normal, average, everyday guys who would want to skip work and go watch a baseball game.
Exactly.
How much more real and average does that get? How many of us wanted to call in and go watch a baseball game, right? If it was training right now. But I mean, that is just they're real. They're not the Greek pantheon over here like they many times get painted, right?
True. And I think one of the things about Garfield that really bothered him about the presidency was the fact that there was patronage and that he had all these political appointments he had to, and he spent so much time, interviewing candidates for positions who were given to him by their loyalty to the party and not on the merits of their qualifications. In fact, that takes him to the situation of Charles Guiteau.
One of the craziest men in history.
Yeah.
The more you dig in this guy, one of the craziest men in history.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they had him back then, too. Yeah. and you know, here's a guy. He even actually goes to the White House. He's a stalwart. He's an Arthur supporter, and he goes to try to get a political position, and he's denied.
Yeah.
You know, he's not even taken seriously.
No.
So he shows them.
Give you an Okeechobee expression. He's as crazy as a $3 bill.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this guy, it doesn't get everything he ever did failed. He was a lawyer. He attempted to be a politician. He actually tries to run a cult for a while. I don't know if you knew this or not.
I didn't know that.
But he gets involved in this really it's called the Oneida cult. No, not Oneida Silverware, but the Oneida cult. No kidding. And he gets involved in this. He's in it for like 5 years. It's this off-the-wall crazy cult. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is why truth really is stranger than fiction.
Yes.
He's involved in this crazy cult for like 5 years. Part of the cult was free love and free marriage, which was super bizarre in the 1800s. He's so unpopular with the women that his name is Charles Godot, and the women in the commune start calling him Charles Get Out because they don't want anything to do with him. He's got a very fragile ego, so this is probably one of the things that leads to his even more break with reality.
Right.
He leaves this cult. He becomes a bill collector because you know that the greatest people of society often become bill collectors.
Yes.
Then he figures out as he's a bill collector that he can start keeping the money and not giving it back because no one's ever going to send a bill collector after bill collector was his line of thought. Whoever comes up with that. He flees. And I think he stays in New York for a while, does like a stint in prison. His sister bails him out. Then he threatens his sister with an axe when she asks for the money back.
This is truly insane.
Truly insane. This is his background that led up to the assassination. So
Yes.
just to get kind of you look at someone like Booth, and Booth was unhinged, but Booth was also very intelligent. He thought he was fighting for a wrong cause.
Oh, absolutely.
A very wrong cause. But I don't know if Booth was just certifiably insane. Godot's certifiably
Yes,
insane.
he is.
100%.
And he calmly approaches Garfield at the train station in D.C. and shoots him twice. Yeah.
In the
Grazes
elbow
him. Yeah.
and the back. By the way, I don't know if you've read this or not. I always found this fascinating. He's so insane that he believes doing this is going to make him so famous that when he buys a gun, he picks out the prettiest gun he can because he wants it to look good in a museum. So he picks out
That's
a 40. It's beyond sick. He picks out a 44. I remember reading through this. He picks out a 44 caliber British Bulldog, and he paid extra to have ivory handles on it because he wanted it to really gleam when it was in a museum one day.
Crazy.
That's how
Absolutely
crazy this guy is.
insane. And then begins another constitutional crisis.
Yes.
That I don't think our founders prepared for, or even Congress thereafter prepared for. And that's, well, what do you do with a disabled and maybe incapacitated president? What do you do? For 79 days.
Yeah, because 11 weeks, right?
Yeah.
We can't. Neither one of us can do math. I wrote down weeks. You wrote down days. So
yes.
We'll
and
we'll
here he
later.
is. He doesn't die, and then come the doctors, and then comes Alexander Graham Bell's new invention.
Yes, the metal detector.
Yes, to
While
find the
he's
bullet.
laying on a bed with metal springs, and then they wonder why they can't find it.
Yeah. I mean, thank God the miracles of modern medicine have evolved so far. But back then, here he is. He's still got a bullet in him. They think he's going to rebound. He's going to make it back. It's nearly 80 days. He's on this bed, and then he gets infections, sepsis, and dies. But during that period of time, but during that period of time, we don't know who's running the country. We don't even know who should be running the country because he's still alive. So it's not the vice president. Mm-hmm. This is something that we deal with for several years thereafter before it's addressed.
And you wonder how it went this long. I mean, we're like in the 1860s now, right? Or 1880s now, and you wonder like how we went this long because. What would have happened if you have a president of the United States and say he has a massive stroke and he's a vegetable now? Yeah. Constitutionally, there was nothing that was set up for. So Jefferson has a stroke and he's laying in bed as a vegetable
for 4 years.
Who rules?
Yeah,
we voted him in.
Yeah,
and even more so back then when the vice president wasn't even on the same ticket. Like, We give it to the opposite party now?
Yeah.
This was a constitutional...
It's the evolution of our Constitution. But we deal with it within the process provided by the Constitution. That's what's so called an amendment.
Absolutely.
We have ways of handling this now. And I'm sure there are things that we saw on January 6th that were corrected by Congress, or at least attempted to be corrected by Congress in the the Electoral College Act.
And it raises new questions. And again, not pointing to any individual candidate before we get emails or any party, but as you look at presidents, at what point do we determine the competency of an individual to rule? And this leads to some of that. Like if he's on his bed and he's half bedridden, or he maybe is mentally incapacitated from this injury, at what point is his power taken from him? And some of these questions have not been fully vetted to this day.
That's true.
So history always repeats itself.
Yes,
right?
It does. But it's interesting because he takes on. Garfield would have been, I think, a very effective. He was a staunch abolitionist. He believed in bringing the South back in, but he also, was strong for civil rights.
Yes, because of his faith, more than likely.
Yes.
He's a diehard believer.
And his passing gives rise to, of course,
Arthur. Oh. So before we go to his passing, you talked about this, but the modern medicine is such a joke. Over 12 doctors will work on him. They start working on him on the moment he hits the train floor, and they'll actually take unwashed hands and start digging for the bullet. They'll do over 3 operations with unsterilized instruments. There's a guy by the name of Dr. Bliss, and believe me, there was nothing blissful about his work, but Dr. Bliss will become the head chief of surgeon, if you will, over the care of and what you see throughout this is hubris. You talked about that.
Yeah.
The British idea was that germs were real, and the British actually started working on this in the 1860s by a guy by the name of Dr. Lister, who later, by the way, Listerine's named after.
Yeah.
And Dr. Lister believes in germs. The American mindset was that's British hogwash, and there's no such thing as germs. We can't see them, we can't feel them. There's no such thing as germs. That's just dumb British people. They believe in the bad air theory, that bad air causes sickness. So they're like trying to protect the air over the president. The whole time they are infecting him with just germs like crazy. And you read this, and I always tell my students when we study history, you wonder how much of our medicine today, 50 years from now, people will look back and be like, they were fools, right? And that's exactly, like, they killed this man. I remember reading, there was a medical historian, I think it's from Johns Hopkins, I don't remember where it's from, but a medical historian writing over this case, and he said more than likely, had they just left him alone, he would have lived. Like, everything would have healed up. He would have been fine if he would have just left him alone. Amazing? They literally killed him. And this is, I don't know if you read this or not, but this is Godot's defense. When Godot is on trial, he tries to represent himself, and they're like, you're crazy. And then they fire his first lawyer. And I think they finally get his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law had a law degree. So they're like, basically, you have to represent this guy. I mean, you have a law degree. Can you imagine being called in for like some crazy brother? Like, you have to represent this guy. And Godot's defense was, I didn't kill the president. I simply shot him. The doctors did. Which...
Yeah, even though he was a precipitating cause, I mean,
right?
It's kind of hard not to break that chain of causation. But yeah.
So we leave this idea, and now we move to Arthur,
the peacock.
The peacock. He had this cracks me. He's best known, as you talked about, for his outfit changes, and at one time he owned over 80 pairs of pants while he was in the White House.
Yes, I heard about that.
Who owns 80 pairs of pants?
And he was quite the partier. He was quite the reveler. Again,
yes.
The reason he becomes president is, of course, because Garfield is assassinated. But the reason he becomes vice president is in order to patronize the stalwarts. They put him on the ticket because he is a big supporter of Conklin. And in fact, Rutherford B. Hayes appoints him as the collector general of the Port of New York. So he's head of this political organization that's collecting money from the port, that's paying back money to the party, and then paying these patronage jobs. So he's the beneficiary of all the things that Garfield's against.
That's how he bought his 80 pairs of pants.
Yes,
right there.
Well, I also understand that when I was doing some reading on this, that when he became president, he went to Tiffany's and bought all new furnishings and took 20 wagon loads of furniture and furnishings out of the White House from previous presidents and sold them at auction.
Wow.
Yes.
I have not read that before.
And this man was, they said that he would work from 10 to 4 and nap in between. This was a guy that suddenly finds himself as president, but I think he also realizes the significance of the presidency. And then, to his credit, the only thing I think he does 2 good things. One, he signs into law the Pendleton Act, which gets rid of patronage and creates the civil service, and 2, he rebuilds the Navy, which I think is absolutely
He's
necessary.
the first president to sign in the idea of all steel ships.
Yes.
We were still using, now they weren't technically wooden like the 1700s, they were usually iron coated, the iron sides, the old iron sides. So we were still using old iron sides back from before the Civil War. We're still using these old iron sides. So he does, and also he attempts to lower the tariffs. So he's kind of an Adam Smith guy, a free market guy, which I totally respect. I'm an Adam Smith free market kind of guy, so I'm all for that. But it said that after the compromises, going back and forth, that after the end of all this, I think he lowered tariffs by like 1.5% was all that was the.
Isn't that amazing?
So I don't think he really did. But maybe you started the ball rolling. Maybe the idea of free market and free trade was at least trying to peel back some of these tariffs and these regulations that had really overgrown, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can give him credit for that.
But you know, I mean, he starts out as a really good guy. He becomes a lawyer, which isn't a bad thing. But he also another abolitionist, and I think his father was a Baptist preacher.
He was.
And he does he takes 2 very important cases in New York. Was it the Jennings case, where he represents this lady who is a black female who is thrown off a New York streetcar because of her race, and he takes the case and wins.
Good for him.
And then he also defended the Lemon Slave Act, or the slave law, which said that, and it was in one which allowed for slaves traveling through New York to become free.
Great.
And so he established himself. He was a strong unionist.
Yes.
He was an abolitionist. His military career was as quartermaster of the state of New York.
Mm-hmm. He's more of an administrator, right? He is
an administrator.
He's a paper pusher. I'm sorry to say it, but he is. He's good at it. He's a really good paper pusher.
I don't think he ever thought he would be a politician.
Nor did he probably ever want to.
No.
I mean, it would cut into his nap time and his pants buying time.
And, he can make a good living as a lawyer doing his stuff.
Absolutely.
But then he gets into politics.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, the vice presidency was his first political office he ever held.
Yes.
Other than, of course, being a port collector. But, I mean, like a true kind of political office.
Yes.
He's vice president. No one would have ever dreamed that he was going to be the president of the United States one day.
No.
And that's one of the things that I love at this podcast. We hit these guys nobody ever thinks about. These are average people. Sometimes, can we even use the term a little bit below average people?
Oh, gosh,
And they're holding these offices,
yes.
right? Like, it can happen literally to anyone. It can happen literally to anyone. He's holding this office. No one would have ever dreamed he would hold this office. By the way, I don't know if you read this or not, but there was a lot of controversy at this time over his place of birth. I don't know if you've.
Oh, yes. They thought he was born in Canada.
And they brought this up during the whole Obama scandal. They brought this up and they tried to find historical precedents on this and stuff. But yeah, they thought he was born because his dad is an itinerant preacher going back and forth from Canada and America. And more than likely, as you look at the records, like his dad is preaching at a church the year he was born, and the church he's preaching is in Canada. So there's a ton of controversy over this.
Yeah.
And his enemies constantly go back and they're like, you're Canadian born. You can't hold this office anyway. And it could have been the first Canadian born president.
It's true. He even though he becomes a New Yorker and allegedly born in Vermont, and you're right, his father was an itinerant preacher.
Yes.
One of the things he also did, which is great for discussion, is the what was it? The Chinese
Exclusion Act.
Exclusion Act.
Yes.
Originally 20 years, excluding any Chinese immigrant from becoming.
No matter the skill level.
Yes.
So I mean, doctors.
You're not coming to the United States for 20
politicians,
years. Even though we let them build the railroad, we used their labor, and then he vetoes the first bill. And they override him, and they agree on 10 years. And still, immigration. My point is, immigration was still a big issue back then. Seriously big issue back then. And you wonder, we need the labor. And then all of a sudden, maybe we've got too much labor, and it's depressing, the wages or whatever.
Yes.
So we just say you can't come into the country anymore.
And you and I were talking about this before the podcast began, but the rail was built on the backs of two ethnicities: the Chinese on the West Coast, and the Irish on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And they build them meet together. And what's interesting is we find the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese are kept out, and then at that similar time period, we find the anti-Irish sentiment all through the East Coast.
Yeah.
There were stores in New York that would hang signs that said "No Irishmen need apply," and there were bars that would hang up signs that would say "No Irish or dogs allowed."
Wow.
Which is some of the birth of the Irish pubs. They started building their own places. Fine, we'll go hang out where we want to anyway, right? So we see that wave of anti migration / immigrant hitting on both coasts against two different ethnic groups that ironically built the railroad together. Right?
So I guess what you could say from when we talk about these presidents is that the actual holding of the office has some transformative effect on their lives, on their conscience.
That's good.
And on their predisposed philosophies. I
Yes.
mean, you know, here's a guy who should have never allowed the Pendleton Act to be passed because he was such a beneficiary of the patronage world, who realizes how important it is to have merit-based civil service and civil servants. So, you know, there's something about the office that does transform these people. We just hope that, you know, that it continues to do so for all the right reasons.
I like that.
Yeah.
Right? And he kind of ends up being, in a way, almost kind of an independent, if you will, throughout that
He does.
final term.
In fact, so independent that he doesn't prepare himself for re-election.
He doesn't care.
He doesn't care.
He's got pants to go by.
Yeah.
And naps
Exactly.
to take. I mean, and what's interesting that you brought that up of how, I guess, in a way, these individuals are morality tales. His son picks up on this, and his son is known throughout D.C. He only has one son, and his son is known throughout D.C. as being one of the first political playboys, if you will. And his son never even gets a job, really. His son just takes the wealth. He plays polo, he shops, he eats, and then
He's
marries.
a young influencer.
That's a good. If they would have had that, he would have been all over that, right? But he basically just marries two wealthy women, and that's what he does through his life. So I guess what I'm saying is, in many ways, what the father allows, the son embraces. Mm-hmm. And you see this, right? Like here's the dad. He's taking his 4 o'clock nap. He's buying his 80 pants. He's going to Tiffany's, and now his son's like, you know what? I can outdo that.
Yeah, I can do that better.
I can do that even better.
Yeah.
And I guess we keep harping on this because it reminds me when we start getting to other political leaders like Teddy Roosevelt, voluntary hardships.
Yes.
Define his character.
Oh my goodness.
Blue blood family, and he says, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Go out west, make it on my own, ranch, travel the Amazon. Like voluntary hardships. And I honestly believe that voluntary hardships produce the greatest leaders.
I think you're absolutely right.
And that's something I think we're missing. And you know this better than me. You've spent time in Congress. And I'm not saying that every congressman, that every political leader is just some Tiffany, pants wearing. There are good, strong, godly people, men and women, in politics today.
Absolutely.
But we need people who embrace voluntary hardships again.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm seeing some of my friends in Congress now announce their retirement, and it concerns me because that void is going to be filled somewhere. And if we don't have the right character of people that believe in the greater good of this nation, we're going to have extremism taking us over. Not that we can't survive it as a nation, because one of the things about these podcasts is that we show how our nation has survived some very difficult times, some very intense divisiveness. But all of that is also avoidable if we train the people. If when I don't mean train the people, but if we offer them the opportunity to learn how to be the leaders that we need to see.
Absolutely. Well, if we educate them and let them critically think, they'll come to these conclusions on their own, right?
They will. Critically think.
History repeats itself for a reason. We just need to keep saying, okay, we talk author, and in case individuals think that we're being a little harsh, here's what. I wrote this down. The Chicago Tribune summed up his life this way. Mr. Author's temperament was sluggish. He was indolent. It required a great deal for him to get to his desk and begin his business. There has never been a president who liked to procrastinate more than him.
And in fact, I ran across a saying that one of his former staffers says that that President Arthur would not do today what he knows he could put off till tomorrow. And and to have one of your staffers say that's just like wow. Yeah, in the White House.
That's a pretty harsh critique. Yeah. And we talk. I got to touch on this before we close this down. We talked about some of the constitutional issues. One of the biggest constitutional issues that came about is at 2:15 a.m. on September 20th, 1881, when Arthur is going to become president. There is now, once he's sworn in, there's no vice president, there's no president of the Senate, and there's no secretary of the House, and there's no president pro tem. So literally, once you have Arthur sworn in, there is no presidential line of succession for that night.
Wow.
Had he had a heart attack, You wonder what would have happened to the American government. There was literally nothing in place yet for anyone to take over. Now, this is one thing, as much as we make fun of him, that he was actually very wise. And Arthur is actually smart enough that he takes out stationery once he's sworn as president, and he writes a letter of his wishes and already convenes Senate in the letter. And then he mails that to the White House, and his thought process was if he died on the way, the presidential order would be there without him. And if he lived, he would just tear it up when he got there.
That's wise.
It's a lawyer's mind, isn't it? It's a lawyer. It's very smart.
Wise.
So before we just pick on, I got to find something redeeming. I mean, I can't just beat up on this guy for 20 minutes. But when we look at this, that's a very lawyer mindset. That was a very intelligent way of looking at it. But again, I guess one of the things I look at when I think of this is how many times the American Republic, whatever term you want to use, was hanging on by a thread.
Yes.
Like someone could have sneezed wrong.
Yeah.
And this whole thing could have been over.
And how many times did we ever know about it? Probably not that many.
And how many times, like you said, do we not know about this? Still, things have happened like that. Yeah. And I guess for me, from my faith, and I think you would agree with your faith, you see the providential hand of God.
Amen.
You see God just working behind the scenes, just moving little things in situations and divinely protecting.
I agree.
There's a proverb where Solomon writes, one of my favorite proverbs, he says this, the Lord guards the inexperienced. And I think back in my life, how many times I was just dumb.
I'm living proof of that.
Yeah.
I realize that.
And God just guarded me. Like the Lord guards the inexperienced. And I think when we look at the young nation of America, there were so many times that we were inexperienced, and God just guarded us. God just supernaturally, behind the scenes with his sovereign hand, just upheld things.
I think you're right.
And this is one of those times.
And again, these transitional presidents lead us to eventual greatness in presidencies, as we will see in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, we get to guys like Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, and
that's
we're going to
get to
a good one. His FDR, for all of his faults, and he had a lot of faults. He did expand the government, but there's some good ones coming.
Yeah, and when we get to Roosevelt, to Wilson, and we talk about his incompetence at the time, and his wife runs the presidency, that'll be interesting to talk about.
Will be.
But it was also raised here in James Garfield's situation.
Yes. Of how much power is actually divested in the role of the individual, and to what vetting process do we have to make sure that individual is competent for handling that role?
Yeah. Exactly.
Those are serious questions.
And we saw it happen just recently. Not before we close, I want to take contemporary history here, but what happened with our Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin?
That's a great.
Here he goes into here he is. We have these attacks going on in the Mideast. He's in the hospital. Nobody knows that. And who's calling these shots?
Absolutely.
And why isn't the president made aware of this? I mean, this is stuff that's we're living these constitutional challenges still today.
Yes.
That we need to be well aware of.
Which brings the question: a lot of times the political mindset then is regulate, right? Put it into law that you have to disclose. But all honesty, regulations don't fix the human condition.
No.
We don't need more regulations. We need to raise up leaders who have the character not to do those things. I remember one time I was in a college class and I had a professor who made the statement. He said, every rule has a name attached to it. Every law just about has a name attached to it. If we educate and raise up leaders that don't need to be so heavily regulated, we don't need more regulations.
Amen.
We need leaders who know how to lead from character, not because of fear of breaking a rule.
Laws were made for the lawbreakers.
Spot on. Was it Jefferson who said that this form of government only works for virtuous people?
Yes.
It only works for virtuous people. Yeah. So we don't need more laws. We need more virtuous people.
We need to be raising virtuous people.
Yes.
And that's where, we as a society have to agree to do that. And we have to understand that absent that, the next generation will not be able to handle the crises that will come, because the crises will be exponentially worse than what we've been experiencing just by our very nature of technology, just by our very nature of divisiveness that we continue. It's going to take...
And we need strong, virtuous people to handle these challenges.
Yes, and we need to let those people know that they have an obligation to be involved in this process, because that's the way it was designed.
Yeah, it's an obligation and it's a privilege. It's both. But those two can't be divorced from each other.
No. No,
right?
Exactly.
Maybe we're doing our small part as we talk about these presidents that nobody remembers.
I hope so.
I hope so too. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We look forward to next week as we continue our series on the 22nd president.
22nd.
22nd.
Yep.
22nd president. So again, we don't do numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks.